Imagine waking up from a sound sleep with the overwhelming feeling that someone is in the room. On today's episode, we're going to talk about a disorder that is a favorite of mine. It's called sleep paralysis. I'm Jay, and this is Somnilopod. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm so excited you joined me today because we're going to be talking about a disorder that is really juicy. And I mentioned in the intro that it's a favorite of mine. I know that's kind of weird to have a favorite sleep disorder, but this one is really interesting. It's called sleep paralysis. And before we get into a lot of the nuts and bolts, I want to just give you a brief overview of what it is, and then I want to relay some stories that people recount of episodes that they have had. Sleep paralysis in and of itself is a brief loss of muscle control, and it's called atonia. Now, if that word sounds familiar, it's because we have discussed atonia before. It's actually something that happens to all of us during different periods throughout the night. When we go into a certain sleep cycle called REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep, we have atonia. We experience atonia so that we don't act out our dreams. Now, there was a previous episode on REM behavior disorder, and it talked about some of the difficulties that people who lack that atonia can have in dealing with their disorder. But since there is an association between a certain phenomenon that happens in REM sleep and sleep paralysis, it is considered a REM parasomnia. And parasomnias, as you might recall, are just the grouping of those really odd things that happen at night that don't really fall into any other category. Things like sleepwalking, sleep talking, things like that. So it is a REM parasomnia, but not just because of the loss of muscle tone. It also involves hallucinations or vivid dreamlike vignettes. Interestingly, about 2/3 of the people that have hallucinations with their sleep paralysis report that they are very distinct from typical dreams. Now, I want to read a couple of stories to you, and then I'm going to relay one of my very own, just to give you an idea of what sleep paralysis may involve. It happens every time I fall asleep on my back. I wake up and I can't tell if my eyes are open or shut, but I can see my whole room. A dark presence is lurking on top of my wardrobe. And as soon as I notice it, I try to scream, but I can't scream and I can't move. The darkness slithers down the side of my wardrobe, across the floor, and looms over the end of my bed. It then creeps all over me, trying to invade every orifice. I feel an immense pressure, like it has pinned me down and is pushing its way into my ears and eyes and mouth. The darkness then screams a terrible screech into my face, and I try to scream back until eventually I manage to jerk my head and everything disappears, and I'm alone in the darkness. My worst experience with sleep paralysis was after I had been up all night doing an essay. When I finished, I immediately dozed off. The next thing I knew, I thought I had completely woken up, except there was a shadow demon looming over the end of my bed. It didn't have a face, but I could feel it staring at me, and it felt like pure evil. I tried with my whole body to scream, but nothing came out, which only made me panic more. I felt like the demon was about to attack me. Then his head twitched to the side and he pounced on my chest, sort of thrashing at me. It felt like it was suffocating me. I tried to close my eyes again and pull all my energy into waking up and moving my body, the whole time with the demon hallucination still attacking me. When I was finally fully awake, I lay in bed for about a half an hour shaking and next to tears. Now, these are a couple of really interesting stories and episodes that people have related regarding, and see if you can pick out some of the commonalities. I also have one of my very own. I actually have had a couple of episodes of sleep paralysis in my life, and the one that stands out as the most distinct happened when I was young. I was probably about 10 years old, and I was laying in bed, and as with some of these other patients, I was in bed and I felt like there was someone in the room. I couldn't move. I felt like I wasn't breathing. I was trying to call out, but nothing was happening. The presence was in the room and it walked toward the bed, and I realized that it was Frankenstein. It was the Frankenstein monster. And that scared me even more. And as I was laying there, the monster reached under and started to pick me up and carry me out of the room. And I could actually feel myself above the bed as he turned to go around the end of the bed toward the door. And then just about when he got to the door, I jerked awake and was able to yell. Now, when I say yell, it was just a small eek. But I remember at that point that everything was done. Everything was back to normal. Now, there are several things with each of those stories that have some common aspects. And researchers have pointed out that there are typically three similarities between between people's experiences of sleep paralysis. There is the intruder hallucination, which is the dangerous presence or person that is also in the room. Many patients report the chest pressure from the hallucinations. There is a painting, and I can't recall who the painting is by, but it is a woman laying on a bed, and she's sort of laying off the end of the bed, and there's this small goblin-like creature sitting on her chest. And then in a dark corner, you see sort of a googly-eyed horse that I believe is meant to be a nightmare. So that's an interesting pictorial representation of that chest pressure that is very, very common. And then there is also, the third element is a vestibular motor hallucination, that feeling of movement or out-of-body occurrences that happened with me. Now, interestingly, researchers report that about 8% of people will experience sleep paralysis at some point in their life. It is considered a benign occurrence. Even though it can be terrifying when it happens, it's not something that we would necessarily consider worthy of treatment or needing treatment because they are typically so isolated. Now, there are some things that can exacerbate the experience of an episode of sleep paralysis. Stress, and in the one example, the patient reported that they had been finishing studying for an exam. Sleeping in a different environment, which can cause people to have arousals throughout the night, can also affect this. Other sleep disorders, like sleep apnea, for example, something that causes periodic disruptions in your sleep, can also exacerbate an episode of sleep paralysis. Now, I mentioned that while sleep paralysis isn't necessarily something that warrants treatment, there are approximately 10% of the people that have recurrent episodes of sleep paralysis that do need to have it addressed because it can be very distressing for them. Again, imagine having periods throughout the night where you just wake up and you have that sense of panic because someone is in the room, and you simply cannot distinguish that between that and reality for a few minutes. So, treatments for sleep paralysis will, of course, include an overall look at sleep hygiene for the patient and whether or not there are any other sleep disorders or any other factors that are disrupting their nighttime sleep. Sleep hygiene, as I have mentioned previously, are those tips and tricks that we can try to help ourselves sleep a little more consistently. So usually working with a sleep physician is going to be the best bet if you are one of that 10% of people that have those recurrent episodes of sleep paralysis. Now, I mentioned early on that this was one of my favorites, and it is because it is so juicy. It is so full of possible venues of discussion. I like to try to keep things grounded with Somnilopod in specifically in science if we can. But sleep paralysis is one of those disorders that does lend to a lot of speculation and a lot of interesting topics, specifically with alien abductions and that feeling of not being able to move, being pulled out of your bed, being taken somewhere, and having no real memory of once you wake up, having that disconnect between the time that it started and when you awaken. There's been a lot of interesting speculation with regard to that. One of my fellow podcasts called Necronomipod did a really good episode on sleep paralysis. So I would recommend that you touch base with them and give that episode a listen. One story that they relay in particular is about a demon dog called Black Shuck that I always thought was interesting. Every time I hear those stories, of course, I always fall back to my training and my experience with sleep paralysis from a clinical setting. So it's always interesting for me to be able to see all of that the different takes on it. So do some research, check some things out, and hopefully you will have a much clearer understanding the next time you wake up and there is someone in the room. Hopefully it won't be Frankenstein or a demon or anything like that. But just give it a few minutes and you should wake up just fine and everything will go back to normal. I hope this has been informative and educational for you. I do really wish that you would follow me on Instagram, follow me on Facebook, on Twitter. Please rate and review and leave comments on your podcast service of choice. Is there something that I'm doing that you would like me to do more of? Is there something I'm doing you'd like me to do less of? If you have any comments, tips, or suggestions, please reach out to me at j@somnilopod.com. And until next time, try and get some rest.